25 years ago, the Sony PlayStation landed in retail stores across the United States. For me, it was the first console I bought at launch ever. Now, at the time, I was in my early 20s. I was 23. But it was the first console that I was able to buy at launch. I bought the Super Nintendo a couple of months after it came out in 1991. I didn't buy the Genesis until a few years after it was already available, and the same thing for the NES. So the PlayStation for me was my first big dip into getting a console at launch, and I was incredibly excited. The summer of 1995 could not go by fast enough once I knew that a PlayStation was where I wanted to go. And I remember that when I pre-ordered my PlayStation from Electronics Boutique in the Holyoke Mall at Ingleside in Massachusetts, I got one of these, and unfortunately I don't have the sleeve that it came in, but I do have the disc. This is what we got when we pre-ordered. We got one of these here. This is the PlayStation Developers Demo CD, and on it, we got some music from Korn and Mother May I and some other bands, and you could just kind of listen to the CD like usual. But when you got the PlayStation on September 9th and you popped that into your system, a whole new set of things appeared where you could mess with some of the graphics features, and one of the coolest things is being able to manipulate a dinosaur on screen. It was very cool. It was a dual-purpose pre-order bonus when there really weren't a lot of them. So this was a pretty cool get. Unfortunately, the original demo CD that I got back in 95 had long since been lost. I wound up getting this from either eBay or from Amazon a few years ago, but I'm glad I have it now. I like to revisit it every now and again. So the summer was full of waiting and full of reading video game magazines and about the new games that were coming out. And one of the games that had me interested in a PlayStation from the get-go was the promise of an arcade perfect or a close to arcade perfect version of NBA Jam Tournament Edition, this guy right here. Unfortunately, this version is not perfect, although it looks pretty close and it sounds pretty good. There's some issues with the gameplay that I have. Some of the stats are overinflated. Like if you injure players, they tend to move much too slow. So these games turn into shove fests instead of actual basketball games, arcade basketball games. It doesn't make it unplayable per se. You have to change your strategy, but understand that back in the summer of 1995, seeing what this game looked like, and then, of course, getting a chance to play it on launch day and seeing and listening to how close to the arcade it was definitely worth the wait, and it was one of the big reasons why I spent the $300 on a PlayStation and went without lunches for a couple of weeks at work and squirreled away whatever money I could in order to be able to have the funds available and actually prepay the pre-order so that I could just pick it up on launch day. I have some other launch games that I want to go through before we get to the main event here in this special episode of Unsealed. For example, this here is Street Fighter the movie. This right here is not the same as the Street Fighter the movie, the arcade game, which plays completely differently, but this is a digitized version of Street Fighter with digitized characters from the Street Fighter movie, so you see Jean-Claude Van Damme and Kylie Minogue and Ming Na and the rest of the actors, but it plays a lot like a Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, which isn't a bad thing, and honestly, although some people tend to pick on this game, it's decent for what it is. It's not feature-rich, and one of the modes of the game makes you play as Guile, a character who I can't stand. But nevertheless, I think that this is a game that you shouldn't sleep on if you like Street Fighter. It plays very much like Street Fighter 2 or Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, and therefore deserves a spot in your collection, provided you can afford the asking price, which has been going up fairly steadily in recent years. What else do I have here? Speaking of launch titles, I have this right here. This is the Raiden Project, a game that I did buy pretty close to launch, but not at launch. This game plays Raiden and Raiden 2 pretty much arcade perfect with enhanced sound, and this is really my intro to the series. I didn't play the arcade games, and I don't even really remember playing the Super Nintendo or Genesis versions of the game, so this was the first time that I played Raiden, and I absolutely enjoyed it, especially Raiden 2, which I still go back to today. This is a great little compilation or duo of games, although again, the asking price on these, whether they're loose or whether they're complete, has been going up in recent years, so this may be a little bit pricey if you're looking to start or add to your PlayStation collection. This right here, and this isn't the long box version, unfortunately. In fact, this is a jewel case that was kind of remade. This is V Tennis, which was a launch title from Acclaim. I never played this. In fact, I still haven't gotten around to playing this. I bought this as part of the Retro Referee project a couple of years ago, and I never got around to it. It looks fine. But again, it's an early tennis game, and it is one of the earlier sports games for the console, aside from NBA Jam and one other that you'll see very shortly. Certainly, polygon graphics are a big deal. That was one of the big catches with the PlayStation, is everything was in 3D and polygons rather than in sprites. So that's what this game offered. The V standing for virtual reality, or the promise or allure of virtual reality, was very big in 1995. So no surprise that games tried to push that element by moving to 3D. So it's not true virtual reality by any stretch, but it definitely did have 3D graphics. So if you like tennis, you might check this out, but there are better tennis games available. This here is a greatest hits version of Rayman, a game that I have not played. I actually own this, and I've been meaning to get around to play it. I know that it's a platform game, and it's 2D, so it relies more on sprites rather than 3D polygons, which is cool. But I've never really had a connection to this character. I've played a couple of the Rayman games, and they're all right. Certainly inoffensive, but certainly not my favorite things. But nevertheless, this was one of the series of launch games that came out for the PlayStation on September 9th. So I am bringing it up in this video. I also have a fighting game for the PlayStation that came out at launch, a fighting game series that quickly faded into obscurity. This here is Battle Arena Toshinden. This is the re-released jewel case copy. You can see the not for resale logo down at the bottom. This is a three-dimensional fighting game, much like Tekken is. The frame rate's kind of sketchy at 30 frames per second. But back then, again, polygons and 3D fighters were still fairly new. So that was the catch, the hook with this particular game. And one of the characters in the game, Sophia, who's a female fighter that uses a whip, I believe, she was one of Sony's early mascots, for better or worse. This is not a great fighting game in my estimation, and certainly not one unless you're really interested in PlayStation launch titles that you need to hunt down necessarily. And it was the first of a 3-game set of Toshinden games for the PlayStation that would come out in years to come. Next up, we have Total Eclipse Turbo. This is the long box edition. Unfortunately, a lot of these long boxes that are in plastic have been cracked over the years. This is actually a conversion of a 3DO game from Crystal Dynamics. We would go on to see several of these 3DO games ported over to the PlayStation and to the Saturn. Total Eclipse, Off-Road Interceptor, Shockwave Assault, Wing Commander 3 was ported over, Return Fire was ported over, and Need for Speed was ported over, Road Rash was ported over, so several of these games, but this was one of the first that made the trip. It is a shooter. It is a fairly basic looking shooter, and I know it might be tough to see with the glare, but nevertheless, it was a shooting game that we did have, so we did play it, or at least rented it back when games could be rented at that particular time. We also had a first-person shooter available at launch. This is a game that some people may have either forgotten about or just don't know about. This is Kiliak, the DNA Imperative. Deep beneath, try that again, the South Pole permafrost, a crazed scientist has unearthed an ancient DNA code dormant for over 2 billion years. Is this the discovery of the ultimate evolution, or does he now hold the damnation of mankind in his grasp? Only you can stop him. Again, it is a very basic first-person shooter. There would be better first-person shooters to come down the pike, both in terms of first-person like Doom, and then your more traditional 3D first-person shooters like, say, Medal of Honor, which would come out in 1999. A real-time shooter where minutes are too long, hours not enough, in future tense. There are a bunch of these little bullet points down here. I have to say, now that we've gotten to the long box games, I love these long boxes. I know that they're very brittle and they tend to crack and break, but this really stood out as compared to the more generic jewel cases that we've seen. So long box games, especially for PlayStation collectors, are sought after, especially if there were jewel case re-releases. They tend to try and gravitate back to the original long box releases. If you can find them, they're nice finds, and they do stand out on your shelf, even if they are a little bit on the big side. I have one more launch game to show you before we get to the main event. This I did buy just after launch, probably a week after launch. And I bought it because of the brand affiliation. I knew nothing about the game itself, and come to find out, the underlying game was actually a lot of fun. At least it was for me. This here is ESPN2 Extreme Games. This is kind of like a Road Rash, but with more focus on combat and more focus on varying vehicles rather than motorcycles. You have bicycles, you have skateboards, you have street luges, you have different ways to get around. The courses, I think, are a little bit tougher to navigate, and there are some points involved where Road Rash doesn't have those. But I love the ESPN branding. Back in 95, I was really starting to get into sports games, and having any kind of ESPN logo automatically made it something that I had to take a look at, even though that tended to bite me on the rear end a few times, like with ESPN Baseball Tonight and ESPN NFL Football back during the 16-bit era. Those weren't very good. But this, I think, is worth a look if you like racing games with that Road Rash type style, that street combat type style. I think that you'd really enjoy it. This is what the back of the case looks like. Insane sports for an extreme generation. That's what it promises right there. I do think the graphics are pretty good. The graphics scroll by well. It is a very good early/launch window PlayStation game. And the other cool thing about this is it does have full motion video included. Susie Colbert, before she got really big and started hosting NFL Live and ESPN Monday Night Football telecasts, she was a reporter for the X Games and for ESPN2, and she is prominently featured both before and after races. After races, if you won, you got a praise from her, and if you lost, she really gave you a hard time on camera, calling you loser and other things. And that's part of the appeal of this game, because multimedia in video games was still fairly new for consoles. So this is a game that really stood out to me, and it is the game of the three that I revisit the most. 2 Extreme is also very good, and 3 Extreme, just don't waste your time. So it's time for the main event, the main course. And before I get there, I want to tell the story. And I know that I've told it before, but it is 25 years ago, so I'm going to tell it again. I did not know about the PlayStation until I went to a small independent game store in Springfield, Massachusetts called Fantasy Realms. We were invited to a special event where the owner of the store actually had an import PlayStation, and we all got a chance to try it out. So I show up at the store, and I'm kind of looking around, and I am not the most social person, although you might not believe it. I'm not the most social person, so I was kind of milling around, and the owner said, "Hey, Pete, come here. I want to show you something." And he showed me this game that was very colorful, and it was a racing game, and I had never heard of it or seen it before. He said it was in arcades, but I hadn't seen it. And it's a game called Ridge Racer. My introduction to the Ridge Racer series, this was, all honesty, although NBA Jam had a lot to do with it, this was the game. Playing this game is what sold me on the PlayStation and made me want to spend $300 right then and there, and I couldn't do it because the system wouldn't be out for several months yet. Ridge Racer is arcade racing through and through, not a very deep game. There's only one track with several different variations in it. There's not a lot to unlock. So it's very much like an arcade game minus the coin slot. But for me, someone who grew up in arcades, I'm okay with that. Having the arcade experience at home was very cool. And this was as close to an arcade game at home as I had ever seen. It was fast. It was sharp. It was colorful. The music was great. These club beats that just stuck in your head. And the other cool thing about this, the store owner had shown me, is that you didn't have to listen to that music at all. He took the disc out, he popped in the Offspring's Ixnay on the Hombre, and I was able to race to that, which was just mind-blowing for me to be able to race to whatever music I wanted to race to, even though it was only the first 5 tracks in the disc that you could access. I thought that that was really, really neat, because this game could be loaded into the PlayStation's RAM and just run that way, which I thought was just very, very cool. This, unfortunately, is not the long box version. Obviously, it's not even an original run version. This is a greatest hits version, but it is still sealed. We do have the ID sticker right there. It is a little bit beat up, like some of the plastic is starting to come off, but I've been sitting on this for a couple of months, waiting for today to come around, and today is that day. So let us go ahead and get this open and check out what's on the inside. Unfortunately, we're not going to see a lot in terms of the disc art or anything like that. As a matter of fact, the original game's disc art was just colors. There wasn't anything else on there. But let's go ahead and get this guy open. There's the sound. Oh, I love that sound. There it is. All right. At some point, I'd like to get the long box version of this, but for now, this will do. So we'll take the top seal off. We'll open the case very carefully. And what we see on the inside of the case is we see, and this happened a lot with Greatest Hits versions, is just like a silver and black look. There are no colors or anything like that, but that's okay. We also see the pretty interesting Ridge Racer artwork on the back, which is just a freaked out racer behind the cockpit of his car. And I love that. I'd love to get a poster of that at some point, maybe when I move into the new place. So Ridge Racer, you're holding the fastest racing game in history. This guy right here. You want to drive fast? Really fast? Nothing provides the adrenaline charged rush of speed like Ridge Racer. State-of-the-art features, amazing control, neck-snapping acceleration, and true-to-road realism make this the only racing game you'll ever need. Sadly, that's not true anymore. Ever, and please always wear a helmet. The fastest racing game seen on this or any other planet, that's a feature. Again, not so true anymore, but whatever. Killer 3D polygon texture mapped graphics and unrivaled car control. 13 race cars to choose from, each with their own performance capabilities. 8 total track variations with additional mirror races. Need a soundtrack for speed? Jam to 6 built-in music tracks or put the pedal to the metal with your own music CDs. And again, that was just awesome to be able to kind of have your own custom soundtrack back in 1995. That was crazy. So let's take a look at the instruction manual really quickly here. And these don't really have a lot to them. This is in black and white. Even the screenshots are in black and white, as you can see here. But it's a very basic racing game. One of the interesting things about Ridge Racer is that you can play a very brief version of Galaga 90 before the game starts. I believe it's Galaga 90 in this. Or Galaga, or it might be a Galaxian. Geez, I don't remember. Anyway, it's a Namco arcade game. You play one stage. If you eliminate all the enemies, again, it's either Galaxian or Galaga 90. I forget which one at this point in time. But if you take out all the enemies without missing anyone before the time runs out, then you unlock extra cars. So you got to play an arcade game before an arcade game, at least a little bit of it. You got to unlock some cool stuff, which you didn't have to pay extra for. And then you got to play the meat of the game. And I played this for at least a couple of hours. And I would always mix this up between this and then go back to NBA Jam and then back to this and NBA Jam until I got more launch titles or more titles just after launch like Air Combat and Jumping Flash and Street Fighter, which I mentioned, and a couple of other games. I have so many memories of the original PlayStation, so many positive memories. It is one of my favorite video game consoles of all time, and I acknowledge that I put a lot of nostalgia behind that. A lot of the games don't hold up graphically anymore. The system itself has issues with full motion video and with skipping, and some of the older units need some serious hardware help. Memory cards are definitely cumbersome, especially the original PlayStation memory cards, and only 15 blocks. So if you're a big sports game player like me, you wind up having to own 30 different memory cards, and you have to keep track of them all. The original PlayStation controller didn't have analog or DualShock, so playing with digital controls sometimes ticks people off. And, I get all of the complaints, but you never forget your first. And for me, the PlayStation was the first console that I bought at launch, and I'll never forget it. I'll never forget where I bought it from. I'll never forget the unfortunate difficulty I had with mine because I was hooking it up to a Zenith television set, and Sony and Zenith hardware didn't get along, so I wound up having a bouncing screen. So I wound up having to relocate my PlayStation into the living room downstairs instead of my room until I got my GX TV a couple of years later. But despite it all, despite the headaches that I had sometimes with the PlayStation hardware, and despite the fact that some of the games don't hold up visually, they're always going to have a very special place in the heart of this particular video game player who's been playing video games now for more than 4 decades. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Unsealed as it took a look back at the PlayStation and the launch games. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much for watching. And until the next time, my friends, please take care of yourselves and each other. And we'll do this again real soon. Until then, see ya.